You've seen the movies. Chiseled warriors in red capes screaming about honor as they kick people into bottomless pits. 300 men holding off 1,000,000 Persians. Spartans as the ultimate warriors, the pinnacle of ancient military might, the toughest civilization that ever existed. But here's what nobody tells you. Almost everything you think you know about Sparta is either exaggerated, twisted, or completely made up. The real Sparta was stranger, darker, and way more complicated than any Hollywood script could capture. Because the Spartans weren't just brutal warriors living by some noble code. They were running what might be the most oppressive police state in ancient history, built on a foundation so violent that even other Greeks thought they'd gone too far. And the craziest part? The Spartans themselves were terrified. Not of Persians, not of Athenians. They were terrified of the people living right next door, the enslaved population they'd created who outnumbered them 7-1. Every single military decision, every law, every brutal training ritual, it all traces back to one thing: fear. So let's break down what Sparta actually was. The training that left children dead in the mountains, the women who had more rights than almost anyone in the ancient world but for the darkest reasons, and the slaves who were hunted for sport just to keep them afraid. Because once you see the real Sparta, you can't unsee it. First, let's talk about warriors. Let's talk about what actually happened to Spartan boys, because the Agoge, their famous training system, wasn't some respectable military academy. It was systematic brutality that began at the age of 7. This is how it worked. At the age of 7, boys were separated from their families and placed in common barracks, not for summer camp, for the next 13 years. They slept on reeds they gathered from the riverbank with their bare hands because they weren't allowed to carry knives. They were deliberately underfed, given just enough to survive, because Sparta wanted them to learn to steal. Yes, you read that right. The government encouraged stealing. But here's the thing. If you got caught, you were severely flogged, not for stealing, but for being bad at it. The logic was a little twisted, but clear. We want you to be so clever, ruthless, and capable that you'll never get caught. And if you failed, you deserved punishment for your incompetence. But physical hardship was just the beginning. These boys were constantly forced to fight each other. They engaged in such violent contests that deaths were common and expected. The historian Plutarch described a ritual called diamastigosis, in which teenage boys were whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Some died from the beatings. Their bodies were displayed as proof of Spartan strength. Tourists from other Greek cities would actually come to witness it, both terrified and amazed. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a lot, but it made for formidable warriors, right? Well, here's where things get interesting. The Spartans were certainly formidable soldiers. Their discipline and formation, their willingness to stay in line, all of it was real. But were they really the best fighters? The evidence is mixed. The Spartans achieved major military victories, yes, but they also suffered humiliating defeats. In 425 BC, at the Battle of Sphacteria, 120 Spartan soldiers surrendered to Athens. Surrendered. This shocked the entire Greek world, as Spartans had to return with or without their shields. They never survived. And later, in 381 BC, Thebes soundly defeated Sparta at the Battle of Lectra. The myth of the Spartans' invincibility ended on that battlefield. Their time-honored tactics, the same formations they had drilled for years, were predictable. Thebes innovated. Sparta couldn't adapt. But what truly set Sparta apart from every other Greek city were the Helots. These were the slaves who did all the actual work, tilling the land and growing food, allowing the Spartans to train for battle all day. And their numbers were so great that Sparta lived in constant fear of rebellion. So they created something called the Crypteia. This was a secret police force made up of young Spartan men whose job was essentially to hunt down the Helots. They would emerge at night with daggers, hide in the village, and kill any Helot who seemed strong, intelligent, or capable of leadership. They targeted the best and brightest, those who might rebel. This wasn't a battle. It was government-sanctioned terrorism against its own population. The historian Thucydides tells of an incident where Sparta summoned the Helots to identify their bravest warriors, promising them freedom. 2,000 men came forward willingly. The Spartans took them, and every single one disappeared. They were secretly murdered because they had dared. Think about that system for a moment. Sparta needed the Helots to survive, but they constantly threatened them to prevent rebellion. It was a society built on a foundation that could collapse at any moment, and the Spartans knew it. Every law, every brutal method, every obsession of the military came from this fear. Now, let's talk about Spartan women, because this is where things get truly astonishing. Women in Sparta enjoyed rights and freedoms that were radical for ancient Greece. While Athenian women were virtually confined to their homes, forbidden from owning property or participating in public life, Spartan women owned land, controlled wealth, managed estates, and exercised in public. Yes, exercised in public. Spartan girls underwent athletic training, often wearing short tunics that amazed visitors from other cities. They participated in races and wrestling. They were educated. They could drink wine. They inherited property on a par with men. According to some estimates, Spartan women controlled approximately 40% of Sparta's land. Sounds progressive, doesn't it? But it's the harsh truth. Sparta didn't liberate women because it believed in equality. They did so because they needed women to produce warriors. Healthy mothers, strong genetics, and children who could survive the Agoge. Everything was in service to the military machine. Spartan women were expected to tell their sons to return with their shields or on them. When a woman's son escaped battle alive, it was said that she killed him herself. This may have been propaganda, but it reveals what Sparta valued: complete loyalty to the state, above family, above humanity, above everything else. And women participated, not because they were more brutal, but because in Sparta, everyone was conscripted to serve the system. There was no opt-out. So where does this story come from? Why do we remember Sparta as a great warrior culture when it was actually a crazy military dictatorship built on slavery? Because Sparta had great PR. They controlled their narrative so much. They wouldn't let historians in. They wouldn't write things down. Everything we know about Sparta was filtered through what the Spartans wanted others to know. They created an image of invincible warriors living simple, honorable lives. Later civilizations adopted this. The Nazis idolized Sparta, seeing themselves in eugenics, militarism, and racial hierarchy. They weren't wrong about the similarities. Modern military culture has romanticized the Agoge, condoning child abuse and dictatorship. And Hollywood? Hollywood gave us Gerard Butler shouting, "This is Sparta," before kicking a man into a pit. Dramatic, entertaining, completely disconnected from the reality of a society that killed its own people to maintain control. The last thing you need to understand about Sparta is this: it failed completely. By the time Rome came to power, Sparta had become a tourist destination, a place where wealthy Romans came to repeat flogging rituals. The population had dwindled significantly. The rigid social system couldn't adapt to a changing world. Sparta's obsession with maintaining the same system, never innovating, never evolving, killed them. The warrior culture they had built everything around became their prison. They couldn't change because changing meant admitting the system wasn't perfect, and Sparta never acknowledged its weakness. Meanwhile, Athens, the city that Sparta considered weak and useless, gave us democracy, philosophy, drama, art, ideas that shaped Western civilization for thousands of years. Sparta gave us a cautionary tale of what happens when a society chooses fear over progress. So were the Spartans ruthless warriors? Absolutely. Were they like the movies portray them? Not even close. They were people trapped in a system that demanded everything and offered nothing in return, that turned children into soldiers and built an empire on terror that couldn't last. The real Sparta wasn't great. It was tragic. And perhaps that's the lesson we should learn from it.